Hi students, I wanted to share with you some best practices for doing your interviews. So you want to make sure that you've already read and viewed the video about interview basics, because that'll give you the foundation for how to do a good job in your interviews. And this is kind of adding some additional tips and techniques for doing a good job, making the most of your interview, and making sure you get some really great information. Most of this comes from a resource that I accessed from the Columbia Journalism School. That's one of the most well-known journalism schools in the country. And they had a post called Best Practices for Interviewing that I am going to elaborate on, and then I've added some more of my own information as well. So the first thing that they suggest is to prepare carefully, familiarizing yourself with as much background as possible. I think that is so important. You want to make sure you're not wasting the time at your interview asking your subject basic questions that you could have answered by doing a little bit of research on your own. So for example, if I was interviewing a Vietnam War vet, I wouldn't want to ask them, so who fought in the Vietnam War? And when did it start and when did it end? I should have already known all of that through my own research. I want to focus on what that person alone can tell me. If I'm interviewing an expert, I should have already looked at that person's webpage, read some things that they've written, and found out what I can about them so that I can go deeper and further when I actually have access to them in person. So get as much of the basics out of the way in your own research so that your interview can be meaty. The second thing that you want to do is make sure that you're treating the person in a way that's going to establish a relationship that's conducive to obtaining information. You're going to be asking some of your interview subjects to really talk comfortably with you, possibly even telling you things that might be uncomfortable. And so you want to make sure that they feel as comfortable as is possible under the circumstances. So this starts with how you invite that person to the interview. Make sure that your invitation is professional and respectful. How you open the interview. So you want to make sure to kind of lay the land, give them an impression of what this interview is going to be like, and be very kind and thankful and show your gratitude for their willingness to be open. You want to make sure you clarify what their background is and give them a little background on what your project is and what you've already found out so that they understand they're contributing to something that's really important and that you're working really hard on, and that this isn't sort of a one-off thing that you're doing with half effort. To be respectful, if you are going to record the interview, make sure you ask permission of the person, and if they don't seem comfortable with it, just take notes by hand. Recording seems easier, but sometimes it can put people off or make them pay more attention to their exact words and not speak as freely, so it's not necessarily always the best choice. The last thing you can do to really establish that relationship is choose your order of questions. Start off with some questions that are a little bit more open, a little bit more general, and once that person kind of gets warmed up and seems like they're speaking easy, go into some tougher questions or questions that ask for more detail rather than starting by slamming the interview subject with those tougher questions. So here's an example. Let's say I was writing a paper about how Madison College operations could be more environmentally friendly, and I was going to interview the person who provides custodial services at Madison College, and that company is called Triangle Services. I would not want to begin immediately with my first question being, why don't we recycle more at Madison College? Or my first question being, why do we have paper towels in the bathrooms? Isn't that really wasteful? We should just have hand dryers. What do you think about that? Those kinds of questions are pointed and critical, and they might result in really interesting answers. And they might be things that you feel like you want to know for your paper, but I wouldn't want to start that way. I would want to start off with questions that are more open, like, how does Triangle Services try to be environmentally friendly? Or tell me about your philosophy on both running the school well while paying attention to the environment. Just get the person to talk a little bit more and see where that goes. The third piece of advice from the Columbia School is to ask questions that are relevant to that exact source and that induce them to talk. So there's two parts there. Make sure you're not asking that person questions that you could find the answers to elsewhere or that aren't really relevant to their background. If they say like, oh, I don't know, or I haven't really looked into that, you just go on to the next thing. But most importantly, ask questions that get the person talking. So on the left are the kinds of questions that tend to do that. On the right are the kinds of questions that don't. So an open question allows the interviewee to answer in any way that they wish. For example, if I say, what is your philosophy about recycling? I have no idea what that person is going to say. They could say any number of things. I'm going to get a big, meaty, juicy answer. A simple question has just one part to it. So if I say, what is your philosophy towards recycling? I'm only asking them to answer one question at a time. The longer list are the kinds of questions that you want to be very careful about and usually avoid. So closed questions can be answered with a single answer, often a single word. So if I say something like, does Triangle Services provide a minimum wage? The person could say yes. And then I don't really get any information. I haven't gotten them talking. I'm not using that interview subject time to really get good meat. Another example of a closed question would be, would you increase or decrease the amount of recycling? The person could just say, I would increase it. I didn't get anything from that answer. Leading questions have a feeling of the answer that you want. It tells the person how to answer in the question itself. So an example of that would be, wouldn't you agree that the college should separate its recycling? It's telling the person what you want to hear. It's making it less likely that they'll answer honestly. A complex question has multiple parts to it. So if you say something like, do you think the college is recycling enough aluminum? And if you do, what do you think we could do to increase it? And if you don't, what do you think is the reason behind that and how would you fix it? I just asked for like 4 answers. That's way too much. The person won't be able to follow. And a non-question is when you don't really ask a question, but rather make a statement. If you say something like, I was wondering what you thought about recycling because I kind of think we need to do more of it and I don't see enough recycling bins on campus. The question there got lost in a statement that I was making. So let's take a look at some examples. What I would recommend that you do here is pause the video and read through each of the questions and decide which ones are open, which ones are closed, which ones are leading, complex, or not really any question at all. So I suggest that you pause here and take a minute to look. All right, if you've taken a minute to look, let's see what each of these questions is like. This first question is asking really 3 questions, so it's more complex. The second question could be answered in many different ways, so it's open, as is the third question. But the fourth question could be answered with a yes or no, so it's closed. The fifth question is asking the person to agree. It's leading them to an answer, so that's not appropriate. The sixth question is open. And the seventh question is a good example of a non-question. It's more of a statement. A good example of a really misleading, leading, and unethical question comes from the presidential race in the year 2000 when in the primaries for the Republicans, John McCain and George W. Bush were competing against each other. And pollsters gave a survey in South Carolina asking the following question. They asked voters, would you be more or less likely to vote for John McCain for president if you knew he had fathered an illegitimate black child? That is leading them to answer. It's giving them misleading information that was not true about John McCain, and it was a closed question. And so in that way, it was using a question to really poison the viewer's mind, the voter's mind, rather than just asking for an open set of answers. This is where I'd like to give you a few of my own personal tips for interviewing. So I suggest that you try to achieve a conversation. If you can get to the point where you're really just talking rather than Q&A, 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 that's ideal. Ask follow-up questions. Listen to the answer. And instead of just plowing on to the next question and following your list of questions blindly, say things like, well, can you tell me more about that? Or why do you think that happened? Or that's interesting. Can you give me an example of that? Like, keep pushing the answers to get deeper. If you need someone to repeat an answer, don't be afraid to ask. That's especially true if you need to take additional notes or copy down a quotation word for word, so pay special attention to when you want to do that. And don't be afraid to ask the person, can you hold that thought for just a minute, or give me just a minute to write that down. People usually find that very flattering. It'll help you get accurate notes and show them that you're really paying attention to what they're saying. So last, what to do at the end of the interview. Make sure that you thank the interviewee twice, both at the end of the in-person interview or phone or Skype or whatever, and then thank them again in writing later that day or the next day. If you have additional questions and you feel like the relationship has been preserved, follow up later. And I really suggest that later, when you have written your paper or you've done your presentation, share that with your interview subject. Let them know that their time was well spent and that you produced a great product and that they were part of it. So I hope you enjoy these interviews and that these tips help you do that successfully. I know that interviewing people is something that I really enjoy. When I was in English too, when I was a college student, I wrote a paper about international adoption, and I interviewed 3 families who had adopted children from other countries. It was some of the best information that I got, some of the most meaningful parts of my paper, because they came from real people who I had met and known and who gave me the most genuine feedback that really made my paper readable and human and interesting for the people who were going to experience it. So I hope you have a similar experience.